March 30th was the last year that New York City had a high below 50 degrees. And this would probably be one of the earliest dates on record, although I haven't actually checked. I actually thought that May 9th of last year was the earliest date that New York City, had their last low below 50 of the season. Turns out it was actually May 4th. 2023 could approach that record, as today could have been the last day that the city managed to make its way down to the 40s, but we're going to talk about highs in the 40s more so, not lows in the 40s. Speaking of highs in the 40s, yeah, there were none of them in April. I don't want to say that's impossible. I think there were previous Aprils that also did not have a day have a high in the 40s or colder, but it's rare. The coldest high this month occurred on April 2nd when the high was 51, and that was a high at midnight attached to the previous day, which had a low of 51. Afternoon highs very well could have been in the 40s. And speaking of 40, that was also the low temperature. So last year, it was actually April 3rd. They had the last high in the 40s when the high was 48 and the low was 40. Both of these very chilly days actually happened on our swimming championship, although we won in 2022. By 2023, the combination of the Jordan Solomon era being over and our team fading apart is going to send us into peril, and we're just not going to win for a while. We're just not. Our team is going to weaken way before it gets better. We might even have to, pull out of the Metro League at some point if we keep getting embarrassed, which is probably going to happen. Anyway. So as far as that temperature thing that I mentioned, first of all, we need to briefly discuss how it happened and how these chances can happen as we get into May, but why I also think that's highly unlikely. So March 30th saw a high of 46, I'm pretty sure, in the city. It was a little bit cooler in the suburbs, high of 45. And it's one of the few days in March that froze. Now, in the city, I think it's going to go down as the last day that it froze this year as well. However, the suburbs experienced freezes on both March 31st and on April 3rd. Almost all of them experienced a freeze on those days, especially the 31st of March. Now, that was one of the few cases in which we actually saw a cold air mass being able to kind of entrench itself over the region, but it wasn't like that cold of an air mass. Think as cold of an anomaly as, say, what happened on February 24th and the 25th. I mean, it was cold, and it was more noticeable based on how mild of a winter it was, but it definitely was no polar vortex. Not any cold that anyone's been talking about for a while, and less anomalous than March 19th, which got a little bit of media attention, but not that much. Not that much at all. So that was annoying. March 31st comes, which is a frosty morning for most of the suburbs. The city has the urban heat out, and they kept their low up to 37, and they rose to the 50s during the day. Then April 1st comes in, and they have a high of 72 and a low of 51. So obviously when cold air came out on April 2nd, if the low is 51 at midnight, then obviously it can't get past that. Although I think my suburb also had a high of 51, even though the low was only 50 on April 1st, which could mean the 51 was actually also the legitimate afternoon high. Either that or the high in my location that day was 50, because I do remember there not being a single sub 50 high here as well. April 3rd was enough of a sunshiny day to bring the temperature back into the 50s in the afternoon. And even when more cold air came in on April 8th, again, it was sunny enough to bring temperatures into the low to mid 50s, even after the low temperature started off in the frosty 30s. And for the city, April 8th wound up being the last frost with a low of 37. My location saw a low of 37 on the 10th, and I think it was even cooler on the 9th. The city was 40 and 42 for the low on those dates. And again, that was kind of like the last frost that I remember seeing. Last year, I think I saw frost as late as April 20th. Yeah, again, frosty morning. But then it does warm nicely back into the 60s. So, without there being any overcastness. And then that warmth, if I remember correctly, just wound up building, honestly. It just really wound up building, because then you have the low, which was in the 50s for the next week, as we saw the high go on 70s into the 80s. Now on the island, once you got to 84, all you could do is get to 86 and then go back to 84, and the lows were chillier. But in the city, you saw 84 and then 90 and then 91 with lows that got into the 70s at times. Which obviously means that if you have a low of 70 degrees, the next day is obviously going to have a high in the 70s or warmer. Again, can't overcome that. But where it got cooler at night on the island, where the lows really couldn't get above 60, I think that the warmest that we saw for a low was like 59. Again, that's the kind of scenario in which the temperature, you'd see that high only be in the 60s in that case. It was ugly. And even at the end of the month, we saw an opportunity for a high in the 40s, but because of the way the storm tracked, the overcast skies were able to keep the high down to 53 across the metro, but it couldn't keep it into the 50s. And honestly, given how the low was in the upper 40s, it wasn't close. The storm just tracked too close to us to have brought the high temperature down to the 40s. Now, I will say, historically, highs in the 40s go out as far as May 26th. As far as May 26th, you can see highs that plunge their way down into the 40s. That being said, we really don't see it happen that late. Now, we have gotten close in recent Mays, and I don't think that this is, given the forecast, I don't really know how close this May is going to get. Given a long-term and short-term forecast, as well as looking at the previous weather, it's been bad, but it hasn't been that bad. Looking at it, I kind of don't see it happening. I don't know how close we're going to go, though it's also probably because I don't know how close we've already gone. I think that our coolest high has only been in the mid-50s, so it's actually kind of warm for the coolest high in May. Now, I will say May 2021 shaped up to be like that. And then the 29th had a record-tying high of 51. The 51-degree high on May 30th smashed the record. But you could see with the lows of 47 how it wasn't really capable of constraining itself to below 50 degrees. It really couldn't have happened. And especially in our climate change era, it was about as cold as it could get. I mean, the low temperature at LaGuardia of 48 both days was a record. And then imagine how the high of 52, that must have smashed the record if the record for the low was 48. Given that the low 48 was a record. Now, that was, again, really ugly. 2022 did have a high of 50, not a record. That's because it occurred on May 7th, too early in the year. And it was 50, so it wasn't in the 40s. Now, 2020 was actually a year in which we saw the high temperature only make its way up to the upper 40s. It was May 9th, not a record, although the low of 34 was a record. That was actually a day in which it was bright and sunshiny, but the high temperature, it couldn't get past, I think, 48 is what it was. And that was actually because a piece of the polar vortex literally broke off. Everyone was complaining then about how it ruined spring weather. Why couldn't it have come during the winter, during the spring when there was, especially during early spring when it was COVID and you really couldn't go anywhere, because that was actually when things finally started to open up. Literally, in Vermont, it was snowing right when things began to open up, and Phil Scott actually had to offer his apologies to Vermonters about how the weather wasn't always cooperating and how, disease and weather, they don't go together. And yes, a piece of the polar vortex broke off, and yes, there was actually a choice of snow in New York City. Nothing measurable, though I don't know if anything measurable fell across parts of the island in that polar vortex, but you get the point. I need to get some water. Anyway, 2019 was a year in which we saw the high temperature for May. Also be 48, and that actually was a record because it was May 13th by that point. The low of 42 obviously wasn't. That was when we had a nor'easter moving through the area, and at an actual somewhat decent time as well. Now, May 2018 didn't. I think the coldest the high man scale was 54, and the low was 52, so it's not that it was even theoretically possible. A lot of people thought that the low of 48, which by the way opened up to a high of 80 degrees the next day, was going to be the last day that had a low in the 40s, which would have been a record, although there was a low of 49 on May 19th, so no record happened. Still, though, which honestly, this would be close to record breaking if this is the last low in the 40s of the year, but given the forecast, it's possible that, especially the suburbs, is really likely, in the city itself, it's possible that it gets to the 40s later on in the year, but, we will have to just see what happens. Now, as far as the years go, going back, I've seen this kind of a mixed pattern. I'll say this: it's definitely not common to see highs in the 40s in May, but it's not impossible either. Now, seeing no highs in the 40s in April, that's anomalous. No highs in the 40s in May, not so uncommon. It was uncommon in 2015 when we saw no days in May have a high in the 50s at all. Every day had a high above 60. And then in June, we saw highs that were only in the 50s. That was definitely rare. Oh, and by the way, speaking of which, I'm probably going to make a video soon about how we've seen so many more warm weather records and cold weather records in the city. I'll probably have to go through it quickly and through each month looking at the records. We'll also examine if there was anything recent, cold, high or low, and whether or not it's high or not.